All right, Alexander. So we talked about Macron visiting Orban in Budapest, and we also have Macron calling up, speaking on the phone with Russian President Vladimir Putin. And they talked about, of course, Ukraine. What else are they going to talk about? And it was an interesting conversation, at least the information that we're getting, because Putin actually told Macron that the situation in Ukraine is not good. Things are escalating. But things are escalating in a silent way. Things are taking place kind of on the down low, and that's what Putin told Macron. In other words, he's saying that the West is arming Ukraine, and they're pushing Ukraine to do something very, very stupid, and they're doing it in a silent way. They're not advertising it. As a matter of fact, I would say that they're probably using the Russian troops on the border as projection/distraction, when the reality of the situation is probably that the West and NATO is arming Ukraine to the teeth, and they're giving Ukraine the wrong signals and the wrong messages, the wrong encouragement, I would say. So what do you make of the call between Macron and Putin?
It's a very interesting call. Now, the thing to understand, first of all, is that the person who initiated it was Macron. And Macron is now clearly trying to establish himself as the great statesman in Europe. And he also feels himself to be, and I think to a great extent he is, and this is a dismal thing to have to say, he considers himself to be the most intelligent person amongst the Western leaders, which is an extraordinary fact. But when you look at the alternatives, Johnson, Biden, the new government in Germany, Macron is probably right. And he does, I think, have some understanding, more understanding of how dangerous the situation is becoming. Now, apparently, when the US was a couple of weeks ago going around telling everybody in Europe that there's been this massive Russian build-up on the border of Ukraine and that Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine, one government, one country pushed back and said that they didn't see this evidence at all. And it's fairly well known that that government was France. In other words, Macron was sceptical about that. Macron seems to be also dragging his heels on agreeing this massive sanctions package. There was a G7 follow-up meeting just the other day, and it was widely expected that there'd be a signing off of the sanctions package there, and it didn't happen. And again, it's fairly well known that Macron is opposed to it. And Macron has also been giving interviews, and he was at a press conference with the new German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, in which he said, we must stop talking about war in Ukraine as if it's going to become, as if it's inevitable, because that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we need to do is to make sure that war doesn't happen, because that would be a disaster for us all. And he's also, to the best of my understanding, pointed out to the other Western leaders that further sanctions against Russia, the sort of sanctions that are being talked about, especially the disconnection from SWIFT, would not just be a disaster, a problem for Russia. These sanctions would be a major crisis for the European economy overall. And he's trying to point out and trying to get European leaders to understand that this is not a good idea. I understand that because he's doing all of this, he's coming in for some criticism from some East European governments. And he's also come in for some criticism from the British. And though Macron was talking for several days about the fact that he was going to talk to Putin and he was going to talk to Zelensky as well, he's going to try and develop some kind of shuttle diplomacy, the British, very mischievously, just before Macron spoke to Putin, and this was a call that had been prepared, as I said, for several days, Boris Johnson, out of the blue, telephones Putin himself, has apparently a very angry call with Putin, and it was clearly an attempt to steal Macron's thunder and to, as we say in Britain, queer Macron's pitch. In other words, to make things more difficult for Macron. when Macron spoke to Putin a few hours later. I think Macron must be absolutely livid about that. He's on very bad terms with Johnson already, and this is going to make them worse. But anyway, getting back to what Putin was saying, it's important to understand some things that the Russians are saying. They're saying that Western weapons supplied to Ukraine are dangerous for a whole set of different reasons. Firstly, it encourages Ukraine to launch an attack on the Donbass. And Putin went out of his way to tell Macron, and also, by the way, to President Niinisto of Finland, whom he also spoke to on the same day. Putin went out of his way to say that Ukraine seems to be looking to sort the problems in eastern Ukraine by force. And Putin also said to Macron that weapons supplies to Ukraine are interpreted by Russia as a threat to Russia, not just to people in the Donbass, that they're seen by Russia as a generic threat to Russia itself and as a sign that NATO is expanding its infrastructure in Ukraine. And as such, all of these things, these weapons, violate Russian red lines because they encourage the prospect of a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass, which for Russia is a red line, and they create conditions for Ukraine's NATO membership, which is also a red line for Russia. And of course, they empower Ukraine, this very anti-Russian country, anti-Russian government, and they empower this country in a way that the Russians also see as a threat to themselves. So that is what Putin said to Macron. And what he said to Macron, and it's again, you've got to read the readout to see that, what he went on to say to Macron is, look, you seem to be the one person in the West who seems to have some grasp of these things. This is your chance. This is your opportunity to really shine, to do some good, to actually speak to your fellow European leaders, to explain to them that our red lines are in deadly earnest, and that if this trend of supplying arms to Ukraine continues, then you must prepare for war in Europe with all the disastrous consequences that will follow from that. And to a certain extent, it seems as if Macron was receptive to that discussion. And he's apparently agreed to speak to Putin again before the end of this year, so within the next few weeks. So we see Macron, for all sorts of reasons, partly because, as I said, he thinks of himself as the cleverest man around, which I'm sorry to say he is, partly because he wants to establish himself as the great leader of the European Federation that is going to come, but partly because I think he does have that glimmer of reality that all the others lack. He seems to be more receptive to what Putin is saying to him than other Western leaders are, and we could start to see some diplomacy from the French. We can't have any expectations of it. I mean, let's not make any mistakes. We're not talking up Macron on this program. He's not de Gaulle. He's not ultimately a leader of great substance, but he's the best there is.
No, we're definitely not talking up Macron, but it has to be said that he is probably the only person right now in the world, in the West, that understands the situation in Ukraine and understands the dangers that are involved in Ukraine, and not only for the West, Europe. To even be more specific, Europe, because if there was a war in Ukraine, it would just be destructive for all of Europe. Europe already has terrible issues with energy and with gas and things of that nature. So a war in Ukraine would just demolish Europe. But why is everyone else pushing for this war with Russia, and why the hell once again is Boris Johnson making these stupid statements and doing these stupid things? Like I believe he's threatening Putin, he's threatening Russia by promising to put all of NATO forces, a huge buildup on the periphery of Russia, if Russia dares to invade Ukraine. I mean, all we're left with now is Macron. Macron is the only voice of reason left. It's if that's who we have, then we are in big trouble.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And that's, I think, the next point to make, because, I mean, any idea that Macron is going to pull off some great diplomatic coup, well, in his dreams, frankly, I mean, it's not going to happen. I mean, for one thing, so many other European leaders dislike him, that the idea that Macron can really talk them round and win them over is just delusional. The problem is, the other European leaders are equally delusional. I mean, there are some people who do understand the gravity of the situation. I mean, the president of Croatia is one. The president of Finland is another. The prime minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, is a third. You do get people who understand. Mitsotakis in Greece. I mean, he's just been to Moscow. He also seems to have some understanding of how bad the situation is. But the big capitals, Brussels, Berlin, and London, there is no understanding of this issue at all. In Berlin, the dominant party in the German coalition, at least at the moment, the one that's making all the noise, are the Greens, which is a party that is not just Atlanticist, but Atlanticist to the point of religious mania, at least the leadership is, and which clearly doesn't see things in the way other people do, in logistical and economic terms. And if we're talking about London, I mean, we have a prime minister who is rapidly losing control. I mean, he had a very bad vote. There was a vote which went badly against him in the House of Commons. What he's trying to do is he's trying to rally support on the Conservative backbenches from the very strong neocon contingent there. And dare I say it, also from these ex-middle-ranking army officers that now populate the Conservative backbenches, who have no real understanding, it seems to me, of higher politics and of the kind of dangers that Britain is drifting into. So he is in a politically very difficult situation. And he's talking all this nonsense about, deploying vast armies, which Britain doesn't have, to Russia's borders and all that sort of thing. And, as I said, calling Putin and trying to annoy Macron by calling Putin before Macron speaks to him. He's doing all of these things in order to win support within the Conservative Party, but in doing so, he's deepening the overall crisis in Europe. It's a terrible situation. The quality of leadership in Europe has never been worse. And as you absolutely rightly said, if the best we can do is Macron, then we're in real trouble. And we are.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Putin and Xi are getting even closer and closer together, and they're making even bigger and bigger moves. And the lines are being drawn, and the sides are forming in as we move towards some very, very big conflict. And definitely it is Russia and China and NATO, the West, the U.S. on the other side. Russia and China, Xi and Putin had a summit, very much along the lines of the Putin-Biden summit. But this one went a lot differently than the Putin-Biden summit, because in this video summit, a lot of stuff got done. They talked about an entirely new financial system outside of Western control. I know they've already got those things in place, but there's no doubt that they're going to be doubling and tripling down on that and moving forward to just build a complete parallel, different system than what you have in the West. So the whole SWIFT thing and the whole financial sanctions and all this stuff is just going to be irrelevant going forward if it isn't already. They also, when I talk about each side drawing, we're moving towards these alliances and each country is taking sides. They also broadened the theater of conflict, I would say, by really hitting out at the AUKUS, this AUKUS alliance, Australia, the UK, and the US. And of course, you go back to the deal with France, where France kind of got screwed on that. They definitely got screwed on that. But, you're once again, now you're moving from Ukraine, Russia, Ukraine. And with this video call between Putin and Xi, you're tying it together to China, Taiwan, Australia, AUKUS, the nuclear sub deal, all of these things. I mean, this is a global, if you have a conflict, it is going to be a global conflict. And I think that is what this video call between Putin and Xi lays out to the entire world. That this is, yeah, you may think this is just going to be a war between Russia and Ukraine, but if we get to that point, don't be surprised if you don't see stuff taking place in the Pacific between China, Taiwan, and Australia, etc.
You're absolutely right. Now, can I just say, anybody who thinks that it is a pure coincidence that this summit meeting between Xi and Putin was set up just just a week after, 10 days after Putin and Biden spoke to each other, and when in the midst of all of these tensions, anybody who thinks that's just chance is just being delusional. As you absolutely rightly said, there is a crisis in Europe involving Russia and the West, and there is a festering crisis in the Indo-Pacific region between China and the West over Taiwan and the South China Sea. And what is now happening, and it's becoming absolutely open, is that these two countries, China and Russia, are cooperating and agreeing their moves with each other. The purpose of this summit between Putin and Xi, very different from this conversation between Putin and Macron that we've talked about. Very different also, by the way, to the summit meeting between Biden and Putin, which we also have talked about. The purpose of this meeting between Putin and Xi is to show to the world that these two leaders and their countries stand side by side. But if you take on one, you're taking on the other. That if you try and impose sanctions on the one, the other will take steps to negate those sanctions. And that just as Russia supports China over the Indo-Pacific region, over Taiwan and the South China Sea and the AUKUS deal, Russia has China's back over the conflict with the red lines, the eastward expansion of NATO and Ukraine. And that's what the purpose of this is. And of course, where all this talk about integrating their financial systems, this has been this is a work in progress. It's actually been going on for some time. But the reason for this summit meeting is again to remind the world, and especially the Western world, that that work is being done, that the Russians and the Chinese are already working away on combining their financial systems. And the reason they're doing that is because they're again signaling to the West, look, this sanctions weapon that you're talking about, it doesn't mean what you think it does. Once upon a time, 15 years ago, that kind of sanction would have worked. It would have been a really effective sanctions. They might have had the effect that you think they do. Today, the world is changing, and your power to sanction us is slipping away. So that's what they're doing. I would add, and it's, again, not been widely commented on, that prior to this summit meeting with Xi, Putin had a meeting of his Security Council. We only get very brief readouts of what the Security Council, this is Russia's top policy-making body, discuss. But we know that from the brief readout that the major topic was economic security. So, in other words, Putin is talking with his government about how to prepare for any Western sanctions. And now he follows that up directly after with this big meeting with Xi Jinping, in which they confirmed that they're talking about merging their financial systems. And of course, the game is being played on a global scale. And just today, the Russians have said that there's work underway to prepare yet another summit meeting, this time of Putin and Xi, but a third leader will apparently join, and that is Prime Minister Modi of India. So there will be a China, Russia, India leaders summit is also on the way. And again, the US has been trying very hard to win over India to make it part of its alliance system against China. But the Indians are known to have been very shocked and upset by the Afghanistan debacle. And it looks like they're hedging, and they're now trying to find ways out. And they're trying to sort of at least achieve some equidistance between the US and the Eurasians. And Modi's now talking about the summit meeting with Putin and Xi to balance his previous commitments to the so-called Quad. So you see how the game is being played, and how, in contrast to the West, and we were talking about the abysmal quality of leadership in the West, the fact that the best we have is Macron, and what that tells us. We see how the Chinese and the Russians, by contrast, have purposeful governments, effective leaders. They're coordinating their moves, they're making their preparations, and they're engaging in high-level diplomacy, not just with each other, but with important third parties like India as well.
Yeah, that's the checkmate move, is India. That is the checkmate move for Russia and China. And they don't even have to get India on side fully. They just have to get a commitment from India that India will remain neutral, will remain in the middle. Neutral. If they get that, if they get the assurance that India is not going to be siding with the West, with Europe, or with the United States, and they'll remain a neutral party to whatever happens, sanctions, conflict, whatever, then they've won. Then, I mean, Putin and Xi won. And a final note with Macron, just going back to Macron real quick, there were rumors about a week and a half ago that the U.S. was about to pull another AUKUS backstab on France with regards to Greece. In other words, Greece has signed a deal, and the deal has been done, it's been made, that they were going to buy frigates, I forgot how many, I believe 4, from France. And there were rumors in the press, and I believe those rumors because a lot of journalists were reporting this, a lot of credible journalists, that the U.S. had stepped in last minute, and they agreed with the Greek government. They strong-armed the Greek government to not buy their weapons, their equipment from France, but to buy from the U.S. Pretty much exactly what happened with Australia. Anyway, long story short, the U.S. said, no. The French and the Greek deal is still on. We're not going to do any of that. We'll negotiate with the Greeks after all of the deals are done with France, after the delivery takes place. But just looking at Macron and looking at everything that's going on, I wonder if the French are kind of saying to themselves, you know what? We're in NATO, we're in the Western camp, we're in Europe, we're in the EU, fine. But maybe we should just keep that door just a little bit open, that exit door just a little bit open, and hedge our bets just a little bit, because we really got screwed in Australia by our number one partner, by the United States. We got screwed there with that, with the sub deal, and we were going to get screwed with Greece. I believe they were going to get screwed with Greece if there wasn't some intervention to take place, and the United States to say, oh, okay, we won't stick it to you twice. I think that's what the U.S. said. Okay, we won't stick it to you twice, but they were about to. I wonder if the French are saying, we better just leave that door just a little crack open, because, man, the U.S. and NATO and Europe, they're really screwing us at every opportunity.
I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the Americans were preparing to screw the French over the frigate deal with Greece. I'm glad you brought it up, because I have absolutely no doubt that that was on the table and that that was the plan. I suspect that there must have been furious comments from Paris behind the scenes, going to Washington, and I think that was enough to call this thing off. I would add that for the French, this is probably an even more sensitive issue, the frigate deal with Greece, even than the AUKUS deal was, because though the AUKUS deal involved, the submarine deal involved a lot more money, the relationship between Greece and France has historically been extremely strong. We have been allies for almost since Greek independence. And of course, France played a big role in achieving Greek independence. And France tends to see Greece not just as an ally and a friend, but also as a country it can rely upon in the event of contested votes in the European Council. So for the French to see an American deal, cutting them out, arms deal, cutting them out with Greece, would have been that would have been a very sensitive issue for France. And I think there must have been a furious row behind the scenes, which we haven't heard the whole story about, and which has obviously been somewhat cloaked. But anyway, let's think about France and its prospects. What you have said, France keeping the door ajar, is traditional French foreign policy. If you remember, General de Gaulle, back in the 60s, was deeply skeptical about many aspects of Anglo-American policy, about NATO policy. He also didn't like the way the US and the British were always basically doing things without consulting France. And he took France out of the military structure of NATO. He never took France out of NATO itself, as many people think. France remained an alliance member. It continued to have the obligation under Article 5, which was to come to the defense of any other NATO state which was attacked. But at the same time, France didn't subordinate its armed forces to NATO, which is to say to Anglo-American command. And that was an important thing. And it gave de Gaulle an opportunity for France to pursue an independent foreign policy. So he pursued friendly policies towards Russia. He had very successful relationships with the Russians. By the way, he always called the country Russia. He always refused to call it the Soviet Union. Just saying. He also had good relationships with China. Now, this is, of course, the time of Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution and all of that. The United States in those days didn't even have diplomatic relations with China. But de Gaulle wanted good relations with China. He opposed the US war in Vietnam and publicly criticized it. And he had much to say of a very critical nature about US foreign policy in the Middle East. And after de Gaulle himself left the scene, to a certain extent, his successors, Georges Pompidou, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and François Mitterrand all followed that line. And remember, the French nuclear deterrent, for example, is actually designed and made in France itself, in contrast to the British nuclear force, which is heavily reliant upon American technology. So if Macron were to revert to a policy of distance from NATO, distance from the US, a policy in which France pursued a more independent line, he would simply be taking France back to what was its traditional post-war foreign policy. And to be straightforward about it, it makes better sense now than it did even during the time when de Gaulle was leading France. Because in the 1960s, the world was divided into two camps: the West, led by the United States, the East led by the Soviet Union. Today we have a much more complicated international situation. There are several great powers, not just two, and it's possible, it's entirely likely in fact, that France, with its great traditions of diplomacy, if it were to play them, could play a much more independent role. And of course, if everything were to fall apart, as it might easily do with the new administration in Washington and all of that, if everything were to fall apart in the West, well, France would have an escape route as well, if it wasn't too obviously committed to the Western camp. So I think it's likely, it could easily happen. There are people in France who are known to advocate it. It is, after all, the policy that Marine Le Pen and Éric Zemmour both advocate, and it's not impossible we could see it in France.
All right. We will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Odyssey, BitChute, Rumble, and SuperU. And go to the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY. Get 10% off all merchandise. I think you have a Good Day mug, don't you, Alexander?
Absolutely. It's always by my side now, because, of course, it reminds me of what a good day it is.
All right.
United States.
All right. Take care, everybody.